In February 1943, the German High Command believed the impossible had finally happened. The Sixth Army was gone. Stalingrad, once a symbol of Hitler's will, had become a graveyard of frostbitten corpses and shattered illusions. Over 300,000 German and Axis soldiers were dead, captured, or missing. But in Berlin, the generals told themselves one thing: the Red Army must be exhausted. They needed to believe it. Because if the Soviets were finished, then Stalingrad was a tragedy. But if the Soviets were still advancing, then Stalingrad was a turning point Germany could never recover from. And within days, terrifying reports began to arrive. Not rumors, not exaggerations, cold, methodical operational summaries. The Red Army was not stopping. This is not a pause. This is momentum. Inside the Wolf's Lair and in command rooms across the Eastern Front, German generals gathered around maps marked with red arrows. Those arrows were supposed to slow. Instead, they multiplied. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most brilliant commanders, initially believed the Soviets had overextended themselves. He expected a brief lull, a moment to regroup and counterattack. But intelligence officers kept returning with the same message. Soviet tank formations were still advancing. Soviet infantry divisions were still attacking. New armies were appearing where none were expected. One officer reportedly muttered during a briefing, "They are behaving as if they have endless reserves." That statement froze the room. Because Germany knew how much the Soviets had lost. Millions dead. Entire cities destroyed. Factories evacuated east. By every Western military calculation, the Red Army should have been broken. But reality no longer followed German logic. The moment doubt entered the High Command. General Kurt Zeitzler, chief of the Army General Staff, stared at the reports in disbelief. The Soviets were not only advancing, they were advancing on multiple fronts. Kharkov, the Don Basin, the Caucasus approaches. German defensive lines were collapsing faster than replacements could arrive. Zeitzler reportedly told colleagues, "We assumed Stalingrad would be the end of their offensive capability. We were wrong." That single sentence marked a shift. Up until Stalingrad, Germany believed defeat was temporary, that losses could be recovered through superior planning and discipline. After Stalingrad, a new fear emerged. What if the Red Army had learned how to fight a modern war? They have changed. German generals began noticing something deeply unsettling. The Red Army of 1943 was not the Red Army of 1941. It no longer attacked blindly. It coordinated artillery, armor, and infantry. It masked offensives with deception. It rotated exhausted units instead of wasting them. One German Corps commander wrote in his diary, "The Russians no longer throw men away as before. They advance with patience and with purpose." That terrified the German command more than sheer numbers, because Germany had built its entire Eastern strategy on one assumption, that Soviet incompetence would compensate for Soviet manpower. Now that assumption was gone. Operational meetings. Turn grim. Inside operational briefings, optimism vanished. Maps once filled with ambitious arrows toward Moscow were replaced by defensive lines, then fallback positions, then emergency withdrawals. A senior officer reportedly asked during one meeting, "Where do we stop them?" No one answered. Because the answer was becoming clear. They didn't know if they could. Manstein proposed mobile defense, trading space for time. Others argued for shorter fronts. Some quietly acknowledged what had once been unthinkable. Germany might lose the war in the East, not in one collapse, but through relentless pressure, Hitler's denial versus military reality. Adolf Hitler refused to accept the implications. To him, Stalingrad was betrayal, not strategy. He blamed generals, weather, and fate, anything but his own decisions. When briefed on Soviet advances, he reportedly exploded. "They are finished. This is the last gasp." But the generals knew better. They were watching German divisions disintegrate faster than they could be rebuilt. One officer later recalled, "The Führer spoke of final victories. We spoke of how to avoid annihilation." That gap between political fantasy and military reality grew wider every week. The psychological shift. Perhaps the most devastating change wasn't strategic. It was psychological. Before Stalingrad, German officers spoke of when victory would come. After Stalingrad, they spoke of how long they could hold. A staff officer wrote, "For the first time, we were planning the war not to win it, but to survive it." Morale didn't collapse overnight, but confidence did. Every Soviet advance reinforced the same realization. This enemy would not collapse. This enemy would not quit. This enemy had absorbed unimaginable losses and kept coming. The unspoken truth. By mid-1943, many German generals privately accepted something they could never say publicly. The Red Army had seized the initiative and would never give it back. Germany could still win battles. It could still launch counteroffensives, but the strategic tide had turned. One general summed it up quietly. "After Stalingrad, we were no longer fighting for victory. We were fighting against inevitability." Why this moment changed. History. Stalingrad was not just a defeat. It was the moment Germany realized the war in the East had become unwinnable, not because of one battle, but because the enemy they faced had transformed. The Red Army was no longer retreating, no longer collapsing, no longer learning how to survive. It was learning how to conquer. And German generals, men who had once marched confidently into the Soviet Union, now watched the maps with a single, haunting question in their minds. How far west will they go? What unsettled German generals most was not just that the Red Army was advancing. It was how calmly it was doing so. There was no reckless charge, no desperate gamble, no sign of exhaustion. Instead, Soviet advances came in waves, methodical, synchronized, and relentless. German intelligence officers reported something chilling. Soviet supply lines were holding. Fuel was reaching the front. Ammunition stocks were increasing, not shrinking. Fresh divisions, fully equipped, were appearing where intelligence had predicted emptiness. One senior intelligence analyst reportedly said during a closed briefing, "This is no longer an enemy reacting to us. This is an enemy executing a long-term plan." That sentence landed like a hammer, because Germany had built its Eastern campaign on rapid decision-making, shock, and collapse. But now, Germany was the one reacting. For years, German generals believed their operational superiority could compensate for material inferiority. Blitzkrieg had worked in Poland. It had worked in France. It had nearly worked in 1941. But after Stalingrad, the illusion shattered. The Red Army had absorbed Blitzkrieg and learned from it. German panzer commanders noticed Soviet units refusing encirclement, slipping away under cover of artillery, then reappearing days later on another axis. A tank officer wrote home, "We strike them hard, and they bend, but they do not break. They reform and return stronger." This was a nightmare scenario for the Wehrmacht, a war without decisive collapse, a war of attrition, a war Germany could not afford. In public, German radio broadcasts spoke of elastic defense and temporary withdrawals. In private, generals stared at maps that grew more red every week. Front lines shortened, but not by design. Strong points became weak points. Reserves vanished. One operational planner reportedly said, "We are no longer choosing where to fight. We are choosing where not to be destroyed." That was the moment when many senior officers understood something grim. Even brilliant tactics could not overcome strategic exhaustion. Germany was bleeding faster than it could heal. By late spring 1943, German generals began quietly discussing scenarios once considered treasonous to even imagine. What if Army Group Center collapsed? What if the Southern Front gave way entirely? What if the Soviets reached the Dnieper before defenses were prepared? These were not hypothetical fears. They were operational possibilities. One senior officer wrote in his private notes, "If the Russians break through again this summer, the war in the East may be lost in a single season." That fear hung over every planning meeting. Every decision now carried existential weight. As Soviet pressure increased, the divide between Hitler and his generals became unbridgeable. Hitler demanded no retreats, no withdrawals, no admissions of weakness. The generals demanded flexibility, space for maneuver, realistic assessments. One general later recalled, "We spoke the language of logistics and terrain. He spoke the language of ideology." That disconnect proved fatal, because ideology cannot stop tanks, and belief cannot replace fuel. Stalingrad was not just a defeat. It was the moment Germany realized the war in the East had become unwinnable, not because of one battle, but because the enemy they faced had transformed. The Red Army was no longer retreating, no longer collapsing, no longer learning how to survive. It was learning how to conquer. And German generals, men who had once marched confidently into the Soviet Union, now watched the maps with a single haunting question in their minds. History often remembers Stalingrad as a battlefield. But for the German High Command, it was something far worse, a moment of awakening, an awakening that came too late.